Alright, so this video we are looking at the narrative speech. This does differ a little bit from the last speech. We have a couple of changes. One of the most obvious changes is that it is a little bit longer. So you're looking for about 3 to 5 minutes instead of that 2 to 3 that we did earlier. Now, a few things are addressed in this speech. Basically, you have two parts to it. You're going to start by verbalizing a published or personal narrative story or poem that illustrates a general point and has impacted you in some way. Now, what that means is that you're basically going to read a story or a poem of some sort that has some kind of message. The second part of the speech is to explain the message that the narrative carries, or why you found the narrative to be valuable. So basically, that second part, you're going to explain the moral of the story, or the meaning of the message. So you have two pieces. Along with that, you're going to have an introduction and a conclusion. So let's start with that body first, because it's the bulk of what you're doing. What I want you to look for is a narrative that has some kind of meaning. So what is, first, a narrative? Really, in general, it's a lot of stuff. You have a lot of options for this. If I were to generalize it or sum it up, it's basically a story that has a message. If I were to give you some of the easiest ones to choose for this particular project, I would say the very easiest one, the most applicable to this type of speech, is a poem. And the reason I say that is because you're going to have to read us this particular narrative. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the poems are the perfect size, the perfect tone, and the perfect message that you're trying to relay. So if I were to pick one of these options down here that says what types of narrative that would work for this speech, I would say the poem would be the easiest. Second to that would probably be the children's books. You find a book that has a good moral to the story, and that's why children's books are so easy, is because they almost always have a, quote, moral to the story. So a children's book would be pretty good. Most of them are about the right length, and when I say about the right length, you're looking for something that'll take you about 1.5 minutes, maybe 2 minutes to read at the most. So a children's book that's simple would be appropriate for this. If you find, say, a Dr. Seuss book, especially the original type of Dr. Seuss books, that's not going to be 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes. It's probably going to be 15 minutes. So you're going to want to take excerpts from the book and read that. So a children's book is good. Again, it's got an easy moral. Poem is excellent. Song lyrics are good too. Most people like to do song lyrics. The problem with song lyrics is that they have a natural beat to them because they're songs. And so a lot of times you are so used to that beat that you want to speak it or even sing the beat. And the audience, if they're familiar with the song, they want to sing. And there's no singing in my class. I don't want any singing. Nope, that's not an option. So please don't do that in the class. This is about speaking the message, not singing the message. Regardless of how good you are, I want you to speak the message, not sing the message. Hopefully that is clear. So you can pick song lyrics. They are easy because they often have a storyline to them or a general message that you're trying to achieve, but they are difficult in that they have a natural rhythm based on the original song. So I would go with a children's book or a poem before I would go for song lyrics. Now, another option, actually two other options, is to pick a famous speech, a politician's speech, a leader that you know, or a famous speaker that you know of, a motivational speaker. You could also pick a monologue from a play or a TV show or a movie. And oftentimes when you watch those, you find coaches that give big motivational speeches, or political figures within the television show or within the movie that are really good. Monologues from plays tend to be very insightful and reflective of the person speaking, so that might be good for you. Think of what you're interested in or stuff that pops into your head when you hear the word famous speech or a speech from a movie or something along those lines, and see if those would work. So if you are looking for something like that, especially for the famous speech or the monologue, what I would recommend doing is getting on your favorite search engine and typing in the name of the speech or some signifying material about the speech, and also the word transcripts. So for example, if I wanted to look up the I Have a Dream speech, I would put in I Have a Dream speech and then the word transcripts, and I would find what I'm looking for there. If you don't know the name of the speech, just like I did with the Martin Luther King one, just come up with the words that were part of it that you remember. Or you can just do a general search for famous speeches from movies or famous political speeches and see what comes up. You never know. There's all kinds of stuff that you can find. So whatever you pick, make sure that you have the hard copy of it. So if it's a children's book, bring the children's book with you, or at least a printout of the words from the book. If it's a poem, print out the poem, or the song lyrics, print out the lyrics, and have that hard copy. What you want to do with that hard copy is to read it through a bunch of times, making note of those delivery cues that we mentioned in the delivery video. So things like tone of voice, including volume, rate, pitch, stressing of certain words, pausing strategically, using vocal pauses, not using vocal pauses, using actual pauses, watching for pronunciation and articulation, being conscious of dialect, all of those things. In addition to that, you're going to want to consider some of the more physical things that you can do, like movement or facial expressions, maybe eye contact is a part here, or gestures, that sort of thing. You want to be strategic here. I don't want to hear you sound like Siri. It would be very boring. So please make sure that however you read this piece, that you are actually being strategic. That's the point of this speech. We are focusing not as much on content, but more so on delivery. So when I listen to these speeches, I'm specifically listening for your tone of voice, for your rate, your stress, your use of pauses, all of those things to be strategic. So I really need you to actually work on the delivery even more than you work on everything else. So practice it, record yourself both with the video of yourself and the audio so that you can see the way it sounds, the way it feels. If you want to practice in front of other people, do that. But in general, when you're reading this narrative, it needs to be expressive both in paralanguage and in physical body communication. So that's the first part, 1.5, 2 minutes of reading some narrative. And you can, like I said up here at the beginning, you can also do a personal narrative, meaning you wrote the poem or you wrote the story. As long as it fits the time limit, that's what I'm looking for. It's a personal or a published, meaning an established narrative that fits the time limit and has a message that you can do well with your delivery. So that's the first part. Second part is for you to explain to us what the message is. So you will do your reading and then follow that with the explanation of what is this poem saying, or what is this children's book moral here. Now, a lot of people do it that way. They actually have it in that order. But if you want to change it up, you can, and we'll address that here in a little bit. But in general, what we're looking for is introduction, reading of your piece, using effective delivery cues, followed by explaining what the message is. That should take you maybe 1.5 minutes, and then follow that with a conclusion. So that is a narrative. Now, what does a narrative sound like? Now, I'm going to show you an example here in a second that is from a speech contest. Now, this is an actual contest for public speaking. They do exist. I know, it's crazy, but they do exist. And this is a really, really good reading of poetry. And it's quite funny, at least I found it funny, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm not asking you to do this, but I want you to see how this speaker uses his tone of voice, his gestures, his body language, his pausing, his volume, all of those things. What does he do to add impact to the overall message of the poetry that he's reading? And as a matter of fact, this speaker won first place in state for his speech and is just very, very talented in this area. So we're going to watch that here and see what you think. Yes, it is entitled Fat Guy Poetry. This was his own title, not mine. So take a listen, watch this, and see what he does in order to add impact.
I love cake. I can't be any clearer than that. I love cake. I could eat every cake in New York City. I can't even go into bakeries anymore. 'Cause I'll eat all the cake. I'll say, where's the cake? I love cake. Get me some cake. And they'll say, we know how much you love cake. And we know that you rarely have enough money to buy our cake, so you can't come in here because you can't afford the cake. But you love the cake. So get out of here. You cannot have any of the cake. You don't have the money to buy any of our cake. I want cake. I want your cake. Give me all of your cake. I love cake. Life for an overweight man can be difficult. However, as these poets show us, if we just shift our perspectives and enjoy the little things about being big, we can appreciate ourselves, no matter what our shape. Cake by Todd Colby, and This Is Not Glandular by Dan O'Neill. I don't use excuses. I never liked them. The people who say they were born this way. Husky. Stocky. Big boned. Let me start by putting your mind at ease. This is not glandular. So I am not a fat man. I am a fat man. Any fewer syllables is an injustice to my girth. And I am damn proud of it. I am proud of this body. I chose to be this size. Chose a body as booming as my voice, with the softness to counter my sharp-tongued words. Chose puffy cheeks so my grandma would always have something to pinch. Chose hands that looked like hot dogs glued to a baseball. Because that's really funny to picture. I chose to be a mountain of a man just in case any ladies were feeling adventurous and wanted to hike to the summit. Trust me, this is not glandular. I chose this body because of the women. Because ladies love the funny fat guy. Because any girl who won't date me if I'm fat is not anyone I'd want if I were thin. Because I am 230 pounds of cuddling, bearing down on you like a force of nature. There is no escape from my snuggling. Because I am a teddy bear whose heart is on E and desperately awaits the next woman to refuel him. I chose this body because of the food. Because there are 6 meals in a day. Breakfast, brunch, lunch, siesta, dinner, and the Taco Bell drive-thru. And they are all the most important meal of the day. Because just like lonely, horny, and angry, we all get hungry. Because my mom told me that some people show love by cooking. So I got cookies instead of hugs, meatloaf in lieu of kisses, and fried spaghetti sandwiches replace bedtime stories. As I clean my plate every time, because it was all I could do to say, I love you too. I mean, I never knew my dad. And Rick was never a hands-on stepfather, unless you would count the less than occasional slap upside the head. So, food gave me surrogate fathers. Colonel Sanders and Chef Boyardee became my models for manhood, which explains my affinity for weird hats. I chose this body because of 7th grade PE. Because if just one fat guy is confident when changing clothes, it makes others more confident. Because dodgeball is a crappy sport, so who cares if I get knocked out first? Because running the mile is torture. But so are the jokes if the fat guy can't finish it. I chose this body because other people not liking my body is not a good enough reason for me to change it. So to the bullies, the lunch ladies, to the women who never gave me a chance, and the football coaches who barraged me with insults, to the jerks and the jocks, and the doctor who joked when I stepped on his scale, to Rick and the Colonel, and anyone who has ever used F-A-T as an insult, you can all do what I've spent the past 2 decades of my life doing. You can eat it. Because I love pies. I love hamburgers and French fries and lobster and deep fried Twinkies. I love me some rice-a-roni and Salisbury steak, microwave burritos, Cooler Ranch Doritos, and ice cream. The kind that you push that had Fred Flintstone on it. I love cake. I love everything about who I am and the life I get to live. No, this is not glandular. It's just fact. And for the first time in my life, I'm proud of that.
All right, so this is obviously much longer than what you would do for your speech, but it illustrates the idea. This gives you a general idea of what you can do with your voice, what you can do with your gestures, all of those things and how they combine together to present material in a very entertaining and or enlightening way. So he didn't just go through and read stories. If you noticed, the process of this particular event that he competed in was to pick poetry and multiple pieces of poetry and then weave them together in order to create a story. In this case, be proud of who you are and understand the nuances of it. And then to use his gestures, his tone of voice, all of these things together to create kind of almost like an acting spiel, using all of those things together to create this image, this story that really comes to life. Now, like I said, I am not expecting you to go that far. First of all, your speech is 3 to 5 minutes, and I only want to hear about 1.5 minutes of you reading, not 9 minutes or 9.5 minutes. What I want, though, is for you to use the techniques mentioned in lecture to practice that speech out loud numerous times so that it is comfortable, that it is confident, and that it is, most of all, purposeful. That's what I want. I want this to be purposeful. for you to use those skills that we talked about in lecture in a very purposeful way. So that's the goal. I just wanted to illustrate it with something I thought was very well done and quite entertaining at the same time. I mean, there are just numerous things he did that really grabbed my attention personally. The gestures, one I'll never get out of my head is a hot dogs glued to a baseball. I just thought that was hilarious. But there's a lot of stuff he does. He lowers his volume when he gets emotional. He gets quiet, sad, very intense. He uses emphasis to add kind of a importance to particular pieces of the message. He does a lot of things. So keep that in mind when you are going through your 1.5 to 2 minutes of your reading, and use strategic editing, strategic delivery cues for that particular piece. Now, the last thing I want to show you here are the little documents that will give you a little bit more feedback on to what you're including here. So over here we have the narrative speech workshop, which is basically what you'll be doing for your discussion board in about a week or two. And it gives you the overview of what I'm looking for in terms of preparing for this. Tell me what narrative that you're planning to use, what has the narrative taught you, or what's the moral to the story. If you pick, say, a children's book, if you've ever read The Rainbow Fish, which is a real popular, pretty good book for this particular activity, but a real popular activity and real popular book. If you have ever read that, it's got a moral to the story about sharing and connecting with friends. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking for in this section. And again, this will be in a couple of weeks or in a week or so when we do the discussion board with this. The one thing I did want to point out is the typical layout of a narrative speech. In general, this is what I see. An introduction that says, for example, "Hi, I'm Kristen, and here today I have brought with me the speech that was written by Martin Luther King Jr. On emancipation of slavery and all of the nuances that went with it, and how it has impacted the cultural moves that we are going through right now." So there's kind of this connection to history and future ideas in that speech, if you've ever listened to it. And it really leads us into this great explanation. So I would start with an introduction that sort of explains the storyline or explains the nature of the speech or a monologue or whatever it is I've chosen. And then I'll say, let me start by sharing with you a little bit of that speech or a little bit of that poem or whatever you choose. And that's where you'll do the reading, again about 1.5 minutes or so. And then once you've done the reading, you say what the explanation is or what the moral of the story is. Do that here and then follow it up with a conclusion. So as you see, this speech really did lead from history, from the past, into the future. And in all actuality, actually made quite a big change in not only our history but our future as it progresses today, or something along those lines. That's just off the top of my head, but you have the idea. So we have an introduction, this is our body, and then we follow it with a conclusion. Now, I mentioned earlier that that's the typical way people do it, but you can change it up a little bit. For example, if you have a poem that really has a lot of one-liners in it, so lines that need explanation or deserve a little bit more depth to them, then you can do a kind of back and forth where you read a line, explain it, read a line, explain it, and read a line and explain it. Actually, there's a couple of songs that are very similar where they need an explanation because they're kind of abstract, or they can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. So think about that. Think about which organizational pattern do you want to use. Do you want to do straight, here's the reading, here's its explanation? Or do you want to go back and forth with sections of the story? One of my favorite speeches was from the fall 2015 semester, where I had a student deliver a speech that used The Road Less Traveled By. And that is a great poem, a classic poem. And what most people think of is that we take the road that is the most difficult and we end up making this great choice. But she actually took a spin on it and broke it down piece by piece, and in the end shared that the story was really about the regret of taking the road less traveled by. It was quite fascinating. So those kinds of things are options for you if you choose to do that. Now on the other side here, you're going to see our form for the rubric. When you give your speech, these are some of the things that I look for. You'll notice that the body of the speech evaluation is tiny and the delivery is huge. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm looking at delivery more than anything here. Yes, this has to be done well. Yes, you do need to have a very distinct division between when you're reading and when you're explaining, but I don't want that to be your sole focus. I want what is the sole focus to be for you, or not the sole focus, but a major focus. I want to be the delivery. So how are you using gestures? Are you maintaining eye contact regularly during your explanation, or do you look down at your paper a lot? Obviously, when you're reading, you're going to look down, but when you are explaining, do you look up? Do you break the room into threes and look at each section? Do you avoid distracting mannerisms like ums, uhs, ers, likes, you knows, and all of those things? Or pacing, or anything else? Excuse me, I went back. Or do you articulate words clearly, like we mentioned? Do you use your lips, teeth, and tongue? Do you strategically use pausing? Using it to allow for the audience to reflect on what you said, or to anticipate what you said? Is your rate purposeful? Do you speak fast to show intensity, or slow to show sincerity or calmness, or what have you? Pitch, inflections, emphasis, using stress with a purpose. Now, I'm not saying that every single one of these things needs to be used for every sentence. I just want to see that you delivered the speech with purpose and not just as a robot, not like you were reading a textbook out loud. So that's the point of this speech. Hopefully it gives you a good overview of what you're going to do for the speech. And again, as always, if you have questions, if you have concerns, you know where to find me both face-to-face and online. Thanks, guys.